Glad to be with you today. My name is Dick Krueger. I have been around the university for a number of years. I'm now a retired professor emeritus. Um, During my time at the university, I had a number of positions. I served as the extension evaluator for the University of Minnesota Extension Service. I taught classes in public health and the College of Education as well in the field of evaluation and other areas. Stories have been a long time interest of mine. My training has been, as many of you have had similar training, has been in quantitative methods. Um, that was at a time when that was the only way you could get through a graduate school program. And one of the things that I discovered early on in my career, I spent a lot of times developing questions and dealing with research methodology. One of the things I discovered was that asking the right questions was a hard thing to do. I struggled with that for a number of years. And as clever and as thoughtful as we might be, I found it difficult to know what exactly was the right question. Oh, you could come up with many questions, but the right questions, that was where the payoff was. And I didn't sort of get insight on that until I began to do interviews, particularly group interviews with groups of people, where they would tell me what the question was, what the important question was. And as I listened to them, I began to gain insight and great respect for qualitative inquiry, interviews, focus groups, and in other kinds of ways of gathering information. So much of my experience, I've spent 40 years or so working with focus group interviews, teaching people, listening to people, and I've learned a lot, people from various different backgrounds, about how to listen. And during that time, I heard a number of stories. Let me tell you one right at the start that to me was sort of one of those pivotal moments. It was a number of years ago. I was teaching a class on focus group interviewing, and one of the students chose a project for her. It was actually at the request of her church, that she belonged to a church that was considering a new policy of requiring members of the church to tithe, that is, to give 10% of their income to the church. And the church leaders thought, before we embark on this, let's listen to people to see what their reactions are to this idea. And so she volunteered. She said, I'm taking this class. I would be willing to lead several groups of other people in the church about this discussion. So she developed a series of questions and gathered together 7 people in one, 8 people in another focus group, and listened to people in the church. And an interesting thing happened. In the first group, I think there were 7 people in the first group. It was unanimous. Everyone in the group was very supportive of the idea. They said it makes sense. You're a member of the church. There ought to be some kind of a commitment. You ought to make some investment of some kind in the church. The church needs the resources. And so giving 10% of your income would be a sound idea and should be a requirement for membership in the church. Well, had she stopped there, it would have been one kind of a report, but she went on to the second group. And the interesting thing is the second group started off the same way. The first 10, 15 minutes, strong support. But then there was a woman spoke up who hadn't said, she said very little up to that point. And she said, I'm troubled with making it a requirement. She said, I'm a single parent. I'm supporting my family. I'm on a very limited income. My income goes for food, rental, transportation. I don't have extra resources. And if I were required to give 10% to the church, I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to continue as a member of the church. Well, an interesting thing happened. That group, everyone stopped talking for about 30 seconds. Not 30, it was probably more like 15 seconds. And then the people, they made a 180-degree change instantaneously, the entire group. And what they told her was, you are a vital member of our congregation. We don't want to lose you. And if this would be a burden to you, then this ought not to be one of our policies that we use. And at the end of that group was completely 100% against the idea. Now, I thought back about that story. One person changed the opinion of everybody else in the group. One person changed the policy, the potential policy of that church with her story about her financial situation. You know, so often when we do studies, we count things. And the majority, you know, the largest number sways the group. That's sort of part of our Western democracy, is that we count votes in the most. But today, one of the arguments I'm going to make is sometimes the one voice that we hear can be a very powerful voice. And sometimes that one voice changes how we look at things, opens our eyes to new perspectives, and can give us insight that can be exceedingly valuable. And after that, one of the things that occurred to me is that as I listened to many other people tell experiences, that theme has repeated to me, where I've seen it in groups, where the group, there's almost like a majority moving in one direction, but then an individual will come up with an experience, a story that fit their situation, and it will change the group. Now, one of the things that occurs to me is that for those of us who are into issues like public health and community welfare and the benefit of others, this is something that we should be aware of. It isn't always the mass numbers. Sometimes it's the stories that are told, it's the messages that we give, and how we present those stories. And so today, what I'm going to do is lay out, in my journey of looking at stories, I've learned a few things about what makes a good story, how to present a story, how to structure it. And I'm going to share with you some of the ideas that I've come up with along the way, and for your consideration. I don't mean to imply that this is the only way. This is one of the ways of thinking about stories. You may have had other experiences that also complement and share, and if those have worked for you, then I would encourage you to continue. But today I'm going to spend about a little over an hour talking about basically some topics, the case for stories, about having certain themes, looking for themes in search of our stories, the elements of what makes a good story, some steps in getting a story. These are some of the things. Now, I've prepared a PowerPoint that will be available to you later for you to use. If you want, you can take notes. What you have received, hopefully, is a handout, about 15 pages, that I put together that talks, it's called Tips on Using Stories in Public Health. And it will contain many of the things I'm going to be talking about. So if you have that in front of you today, that might be useful just to refer to from time to time. If you have questions as we go through, here's what I'm going to suggest. There is a place here called a chat room where you can write down your questions, or if you want an observation, I would encourage you to do so. I'm not going to stop and ask for questions, but the last half hour we'll spend with a Q&A session. And I've asked Grace if she would be watching the chat room for questions and cluster them together so that we can talk about those questions during the last half hour. So as we go along, feel free to make some comments or specifically a question, put it in the chat room, and we'll get to those as we go along. Okay, that's, I think, it. I'm going to jump now to my sharing screen, and I'll be looking at some PowerPoint slides. So let's just take a look now and see if we can move to that section. And here we go. Okay, good. Here's some ideas about how public health workers can use stories. And there are a number of others, but these are the ones that sort of come top of mind. A lot of people don't know what public health workers do. And to be able to use stories to describe the efforts and the results are very important. You know, the efforts of how the work gets done, the results in terms of what is success? What does it look like? And how does it take place? Stories can be very helpful for that. To describe how the work of public health is done, to inspire people, whether they be our customers, the general public, or staff, volunteers, or sponsors. Stories in public health can encourage people to take action, to do things, and inspire people. Another one is to train staff, or inculcate culture or values of people who are already in the field. And also to understand vexing problems and develop solutions for those problems. When we use stories, a number of times people make the mistake of assuming a story is a description or an essay, or they sometimes assume that it has to be sort of humorous. You know, a story really is something that is about a person that capsulizes an idea, a concept. And for the story to work, it has to have certain elements to it, fit a situation, be told effectively, and follow some academic traditions. And now in most storytellers, this doesn't fit, but I'm going to argue the case that in public health, there's certain academic traditions that we need to be thoughtful about and pay attention to. I'm going to come back to that one in a minute. So I'm going to go now toward the one with themes. And you should see in front of you now a slide that is kind of blue and, kind of a blue tint. And it has 5 themes. And then there's a second one that has another 5 themes. These themes are sort of what you might call baskets, are categories where stories might fit. That one of the things I've learned that when you go in search of a story, you want them to kind of fit into a category. And as I think about the kinds of categories that are most useful for public health, I've come up with these 10. Now, you might come up with some additional ones, and that's fine. I don't mean to imply these are the only 10. But these 10 have been cited by others and identified as ones that many organizations can find useful. And the first one is basically a customer or client who succeeds. And this is a story of somebody who set out as a goal to do something and they accomplished it. Let me give you an example of that. I'm going to read a story to you that actually was told by a well-known teacher American writer and teacher trained as a Buddhist monk. His name was Jack Kornfield, and he tells a story. It's a short story about an angry military officer experience with mindfulness. And here's the story that he tells. There was a young Army lieutenant who got angry so often and caused so much conflict that his superior officer ordered him to do an 8-week mindfulness training course. One day during the 6th week of the training, he stopped by the grocery store. It was crowded. The checkout lines were long, and he was tired. To make matters worse, the woman in front of him had only one item and should have been over there in the express lane. His irritation only grew when she got to the front of the line and the clerk started cooing over the baby that she was holding. And then she actually handed the baby to the clerk. And at that time, the lieutenant kind of inside was going ballistic, thinking, we all are trying to get home. What are they doing? He could feel the anger rise, but because he'd begun to train in mindfulness, he could also feel the pain that came with it, the stress, the tension that came with holding it. And he'd learned what to do. He took deep breaths, acknowledged the anger he felt, and let it subside. By the time it was his turn, he was calmer, and he said to the clerk, "That was a cute kid you were holding." And the clerk said, "Oh, he's my boy, you see. My husband was in the military. He was killed in combat last year, so now I have to work. My mom brings my boy in once a day so I can see him." Hearing that, the lieutenant was brought to tears. Now, it's a story of an accomplishment. He'd learned some of the basics. Had he not learned that, it might have been a very different kind of a consequence. But it was something that he was successful at. I want to tell one more story. This, I found it interesting. It was a story of my friend. It's a true story. My friend Anne wanted to lose 15 pounds. She'd tried a number of diets and strategies, but nothing worked. One day she read about a strategy for weight loss, and she enthusiastically told me about it and said that it was a straightforward plan that involves 3 steps. Number 1, identify a cause or perhaps a political candidate that you really don't like. She said, this part is important. You have to really dislike the cause or the candidate. Number 2, you make out a sizable check for the cause or the candidate. Anne said that she made a check out for $500 for a political candidate and she intensely disliked. Step 3, you give the check to a friend with the instructions that if you don't reach your goal of losing 15 pounds in 60 days, then the friend sends the check to the political candidate. If you do reach your goal, you get the check back and you can tear it up. Anne felt like this was a serious commitment. $500 was a lot of money to her, and she didn't want it to go to somebody who had political views she disliked. She was off to a great start. When she went out with her friends, they would ask her why she was eating a light meal and wasn't having dessert. She told them about her plan, and they all applauded, and they were pulling their desserts away from her to avoid temptation. After a month, I asked her how the plan was going, and she said she was pleased with the steady progress. She asked what I thought of the plan, and I suggested another motivation, that if the check does go through and the political candidate gets the money, then you will be considered a sizable donor, and be placed on a variety of mailing lists for similar candidates in the future. Oh dear, she said, I never would have thought of that. Within 45 days, she'd met her goal, and she was delighted. She called up her friend and told her to tear up the check. But her friend said, wait a minute. You said you would have lost 15 pounds by 60 days. I'm holding a check for another 15 days just to be sure you won't regain the weight. Anne was disappointed, but her friend was right. She needed to keep the weight off. And again, she was successful after 60 days, and the check was torn up. Well, she made an accomplishment and was successful. Another category, I'm not going to give examples, but in the Annals of Internal Medicine, back in, I forget the year, there's a report out of St. Louis about a hospital that instituted an interesting plan for reducing blood pressure. And the plan was to have community members who were successful come in and tell their stories about how they did it. They videotaped them. And what they did was something interesting. They gave the videos to others in the community. Actually, they set up a control design where experimental group and a control group. And the experimental group got a copy of the videos from the other neighbors who had done it. The control group got no information. They just got some information on basically on blood pressure. And they found that the people who listened to the stories lost, or the blood pressure went down. They were able to control it. And the writers of the story said, you know what was it working, we believe, is they were hearing stories from people that looked like them. These were inner city residents of St. Louis. They didn't walk around wearing white coats that said MD or RN or other things on them. They looked like the people who were having the struggles. And these were credible people with practical kinds of tips. But basically, they were telling their stories. This was an example of our second theme here of bright spots, of where you find people who are doing something right, or another word for it is positive deviance. And that's shared with other people who also are able to make those kinds of changes. And that's another kind of a category of story that's very powerful, of people that, of looking around for people that are already doing what you want, or the desirable, healthy kinds of processes, finding out what it is, how they do it, and sharing their experiences and stories, or seeing what is transferable to another institution or another place. I like the words, I use the topic bright spots instead of positive deviance, partly because it's more, I think it's easier to understand. Positive deviance sounds a little too complicated, but the concept basically is the same. If you want to know more, there's an excellent article in a book by Chip and Dan Heath called Switch, where they spend a whole chapter talking about bright spots and how you can get people to move to change by using bright spot research. So these two themes, I think, are among the most useful in public health. But then there are others. I'm going to go through them quickly. An unanticipated outcome. You know, in public health, in many studies, what happens is we have a program, an effort to do something, but it does something else instead. An unintended consequence, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. And a story about something that happens. And sometimes it can be a very beneficial one that we want to pay attention to. One of the things I've learned in evaluation is that these unintended consequences or outcomes can be as important as your intended consequence, case in point very quickly is the DARE program, a drug resistance program aimed at teenagers. But the program itself has little or no impact on changing drug use of children or young people. But what it does do, it has an unintended consequence. It allows kids and police officers to get acquainted and communicate with each other, builds respect and communication skills of both kids and cops. And what happens is they learn to talk to each other. That is a very desirable, that is not the primary goal of the program. It's an unintended consequences, but a wonderful one. Going on quickly, emblematic success stories, a success story that only can happen from your agency, your group, or a critical incident in the history of the organization. A critical incident could be something like COVID. It's a big event. What did it do? How did it change? And are there others? And those who are interested in knowing how change takes place, a study of critical incidents can be very useful. Another kind of a theme is organizational creation stories, stories about how the organization was created, what were the early goals, the successes, the difficulties, the challenges. Another, how employees do their job. What exactly do the people in public health do? How does that work? It can be very useful in staff training or in communicating accountability to the public. Employees solving ill-structured problems. There's an interesting example coming out of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, where they were facing a problem of many of the engineers that put a person on the moon many years ago have retired. And the skills and the knowledge of how to do that had sort of been largely lost, especially the ill-structured ones, that when something happened that wasn't planned, the tacit knowledge that was lost. And so what they did, they invited back the old timers, the retirees, to come back, have coffee with the younger engineers and tell stories about how they dealt with ill-structured problems. So what did you do when the O-rings froze? How did you solve that problem? And these stories, they would tell them sort of how to think about an ill-structured problem. The same can happen in public health. Survival lessons from savvy, experienced staff, very important. Lessons learned when staff break the rules. This is an interesting one. Grace, can you show that little video right now where we have the one from the television show? And yes, I'll stop my screen sharing for a moment and
I will get that pulled up.
Pull it up. Here's a short video, a couple minutes long, that actually was on CBS News back about a month and a half ago. To me, that's an example of both bright spot. Here's a person who did the right thing, but also she broke the rules. She was a little worried about driving in her stocking feet, but she did it for the right reasons. And a story we'd like to see more of people going out of their way to help people to accomplish something. And that story actually was shown on both the TV channels here in the Twin Cities as well as nationally. Okay, I want to continue on with the slides, and I'm going to move more quickly here. Hold on, I'm going to go back to my screen share. Okay. Okay, here we go. In the process of gathering your stories, here are some things to be concerned about. Is that we use what we call a disciplined inquiry. That means you that you have a plan, a process of how you're going to gather, of a way of capturing the story. Are you taking notes? Are you recording it? But you're getting it as accurately as you can, and you're following the protocol that we often follow as we're seriously gathering information. The stories are truthful, and what we use is the one sometimes in that there's that radio show or a TV show, no, it's radio, the Moth Radio Hour, where they have a phrase, it's true as remembered by the storyteller. And so that's the principle, is that we're trying to not have something fabricated, but in the memory of the storyteller, this was a true story. We want to respect confidentiality, and the storyteller gives us insight as to how we treat it. There's several different layers of confidentiality. One would be that the person says it's okay to tell the story and it's okay to have my name attached to it. That's often the one we would prefer, if at all possible, is that we tell it as they have told us the story and we have their name. Now, sometimes, though, they will say to us, you can tell the story, but don't tell my name. You can tell about sort of a characteristic about me or something about where I live, but don't use my name. Well, that's another level. Still, another level is that they might say, I don't want you to tell the specific story, because that they'll be able to identify me by hearing the story. So don't tell the story, but you can tell in general terms about the theme of the story, what the story is doing, but without the details. And then don't provide the name, but again, you can provide some general information. And then there's a fourth one. We usually don't see this one, but I have encountered it on rare occasions, where the person tells me the story and says, I'm telling you this story to help you as a researcher in your background, but I don't want you to retell the story, and I don't want you to even tell the theme of the story, because it has consequences of even telling the theme. And so in that case, that is one of the most limiting ones, that you're very much restricted in terms of what you can do. But those are the things that are important, is that you pay attention to the issue of confidentiality. The issue of representativeness is something that you should think about as well, of how often does this story occur? Is this a rare once in a lifetime? Is it once that it's the only time you've heard it? Or is it something that can reoccur on a frequent basis? If you're not sure, you can ask the storyteller, has this happened before? Does it happen to other people? Or ask other people within the community who are familiar with the situation, that here's a story. Does this happen? And how frequently does this happen? Often the person receiving the story may not know, is this common? Is it uncommon? And in telling the story, it can be important to communicate to the people listening, how often does this happen? Does it happen rarely? Does it happen just occasionally? So these are some of the concerns. Here's a quick little analogy to think about. That looking for stories, the search for stories is like looking for fossils. You have an idea of what you're going to look for, and you go to a location where they're likely to be found. Now, that's an important one. Same with stories. You think about, okay, there's a type of a story. Where might I find those stories? Among what types of people? And so you go there. You ask for permission to get a story. You seek advice from others, locals, experts who might have knowledge about it. Do they have suggestions of where to look, who to ask? You get the equipment you need for the search. It could be a notepad, a pen, maybe even an audio recorder. You start looking, you document your findings, and you handle the results carefully. So a story is sort of analogous to the experience of looking for fossils. A story has certain parts to it, a plot. There is some unfolding action that takes place here. It can be explained very briefly, but it's moving in some direction. There are characters, there are people. It's placed in a setting. There is some kind of a logical flow, and usually it can be told fairly briefly, 1 to 3 minutes. Yes, you could tell a longer story, but often they're not as useful for, because oftentimes what's most useful is the short little story captures someone's attention, illustrates a point, and moves on. But it's not just a description or a discussion or an essay or rambling details. To the point, here's the plot, holds their attention, and moves on. Here to me is sort of, if you were to ask me what makes a great story, number one, it's about a person. I can't tell you how many times I see stories told by organizations, by, even my beloved University of Minnesota will tell a story. Often it's not about a person, it's about a department, a unit, a band, an athletic team, but it's not about a person. People are more interesting to us than a group or an organization, or whatever that might be. A great story is about a person. It draws you in, holds your attention, and you want to share the story with others. As a matter of fact, often that's a characteristic. You want to go out and tell someone else the story you just heard. And as you're hearing it, you wonder how that might end. And you wouldn't mind hearing the story a second time. That's a great story. There's a challenge of telling your own story. Oftentimes, if you are the hero, the center person of attention, it makes it very hard for you to convey a story about yourself. Instead, make the hero someone from the community. A client, a customer, a person who is successful. Make them the hero. Yes, you may have given them some information. Yes, you may have helped them along the way, but they're the hero, not the public health worker. You make them look good. You might be playing the role of a coach or an advisor or a teacher. It's sort of like, in Star Wars, Luke Skywalker was the hero. But Obi-Wan Kenobi was the one who would whisper things, give him advice, help him through the difficulties, interpret what was happening. Your role might be the Obi-Wan Kenobi. You may be the one who identifies the story, tells someone else's story. They're the hero. You're the one that kind of guides them along the way. As you think about being a storyteller, as you're hearing the story, by the way, one of the things you'll discover right away that when you ask someone in the handout, I don't have a slide for this, but one of the things you'll notice right away as you go in pursuit of a story, don't ask for a story. If you do, you'll get a blank look like, I have no idea. What they sort of are thinking is that I'm supposed to tell you a joke or something. I'm supposed to tell you this. No, just ask them, tell me about something. Tell me, and give them a specific topic. Tell me about how that works. Don't use the word story. We'll use that word as we talk about it, but as you talk to a person, that word will trip people up and will cause them difficulties. And as you're listening to them talk, keep in mind that you're going to have to do some reassembly of this. A story, when it's told, especially the first time, it comes out in bits and pieces. a fragment here, a fragment there. Your job, you got to put that story together in a logical kind of flow that makes sense. And so as you're listening for the dialogue, the words that are said, for the details, for the emotions. How are they feeling? You get them to talk about that. And maybe if you can include things like suspense, surprise, or humor. Often those are things that people find delightful in a story. Use descriptive language. And toward the end, be sure that your key message is told. In the literature on stories, there's several kinds of plots, and I'm saying these that as you look to gather a story, it may be a variation of this, or these plots might work for you. But these are plots that actually a lot of stories in media, television, movies, other places, they'll use a plot and a variation. One of them that's quite often used is the hero's journey. Basically, there's a character who's facing obstacles, and there is a journey on the way, and the story tells about their journeys. And there's all kinds of stories out there with this particular kind of a plot line. Another one is what you might call the surprise, or the aha, or the eureka moment. This is a moment when the story is told and then something happens. A light goes on, a discovery, perspective changes about how something is taking place. And that sort of, the story I told about the tithing in church is sort of like one of those aha moments. By the way, the word eureka, there's an interesting story about this, that the eureka, back in the year about 300 BC, there was a Greek mathematician and scientist called Archimedes. And he was a very clever fellow. And he was given a perplexing problem by Hiero, the ruler of Syracuse. And he had a crown made supposedly of gold. And the crown, because of an irregular shape, they had to determine how much gold was in the crown. And the ruler was concerned about whether he had given this gold to the crown maker, and did he make the right amount. Well, Archimedes was taking a bath one day, and he had the bathtub filled to the very top. And as he got in, he saw that the water went out, and the water that went out was the volume of water that was of his body that was in the water. And a discovery came to mind, a brilliant discovery that and supposedly this discovery was that he could put this crown into water. It would displace a certain amount of water, and that volume, he could then determine what the weight was in gold, and he could weigh the crown and look at the difference between the two. He was so amazed by that, he supposedly, now this is where the story, we're not sure if it's really true, jumped out of the pool without clothes on, ran down the street in Syracuse in ancient Greece, shouting the words, Eureka, Eureka, I have found it, I have discovered it. That's what it meant in Greece. And so the story of the Eureka moment, a moment where suddenly something comes to light, and a new chapter, a new way of looking at it is apparent. Now, here's another one that's an interesting plot where an important lesson is learned. It isn't quite the same level of discovery, but the person wants something, they face barriers and difficulties, they need a guide who helps them, and they basically are able to accomplish. So it's very similar to the hero story. But these plots are very helpful kind of in envisioning how that story might work. Now I'm going to go through quickly some slides that talk about some of the steps of how you gather a story. And very quickly, the first thing is we identify a theme and create a plan. What's your theme? How are you going to do it? And it's nice if you jot some of these things down in writing so you can share them with a colleague or someone else to kind of give you some advice on how to make it better. Get others to help. Oftentimes, what you need, if you're looking for a story, you may not know that, you already may know some people who have a story, but there are others out there. You may talk to colleagues, people around you, and saying, I'm looking for a story that fits this theme. Do you know of someone who's experienced that? And oftentimes there are friends, there are colleagues, there are other people in the community who are aware of things. And by asking questions, they could direct you to someone who might have an experience they'd be willing to share with you. But don't overlook the fact that others may be helpful to you. We've even had organizations that will sort of put out a little notice that we'd like to, in the next month, collect stories on a certain theme. So be on the lookout for stories that fit this particular theme. And when you see them, let us know so we can follow up. Step 3, tips on story listening. Here's one, but as you listen to people, use phrases like, tell me about the situation, tell me about the problem, who helped, how did it work, what happened next, describe the situation, what did people say. These are all rich data that you can use when you weave it into the story. And don't forget to spend some time on the emotion. The emotion is what often will carry the story, the most powerful part. This is what a story, of all the forms of information we gather, a story can convey a sense of emotion that no other data can give you. I've seen numbers, I've seen charts, I've seen diagrams, and honestly can tell you that I've never seen a chart that I've cried over. I probably should have, but I never did. I've looked at diagrams, never affected me emotionally. But when I compare it to stories I've heard, that affects me and that changes me. And so emotions are a very important part in the listening. And think about how you describe those emotions. Write up the best stories. Sometimes you can get the person to write up their story, but oftentimes it's better if I find that if I write it up or one of the members of our team writes it up. One of the just tips and bits of information, Ira Glass, who has a show on radio, uh, what is it, This American Life. He has a couple little videos. He talks about how he gathers stories, and he makes an interesting comment. He said, we're a team of professional story gatherers. We do it all the time. And we're looking for good stories. But he said, our batting average isn't really great. That we may go to 5, 10 people to get stories. They'll tell us a description. But he said, deep down, we know this story is not that compelling. It isn't that strong of a story. And so don't be surprised if you are getting stories and that's okay. That's nothing demeaning about a story. But as you're selecting the stories to retell, this is where you may want to select those who are the most powerful that fit your theme, that are able to accomplish the goals you want. Don't assume that the first story you hear is going to do that, or the second. You may have to get several, or you might just get lucky and be fortunate to get several of them at the same time. what I would encourage you to think about is revising and sharing stories. You might put them, in a different. Some organizations even kind of develop a little, put them online, a little catalog where people put them into different kind of clusters or categories. Um, they can be shared. A number of years ago, I was uh, advising a student who was writing her dissertation on an interesting topic. Uh, the topic was she worked at the Minnesota Zoo, and she said that early on in her career, in her education, she developed a love for animals, particularly wild animals. And she said that directed her, guided her life. And she said, I'd like to know more about how that happens. And I'd like to interview people who are professionals. They made it their life's work to work with wild animals. I'd like to know how that came about, how they got inspired, what led them. And so she did. She carried out 25 interviews with professionals who worked in the field and asked them their stories about what was happening, what influenced them, what stories did they tell. And what she did was she looked over the pattern of those stories. What was happening? Was there some kind of a pattern? And indeed, she found a pattern. She said what was interesting of these people, something happened between the ages of 10 and 13. And she said they had an experience. They went someplace out of the home, and it was a person, a non-parent, usually a non-relative. It might be a park ranger, a naturalist at some kind of a place, but someone introduced them to a wild animal, told them a story, told them experiences about it. And it was if a little flame had been lit, it piqued their interest. They went away with that saying, I'd like to know more about that animal, that butterfly, whatever it might have been. And then they said there was something happened that was interesting. They told others, their parents, a scout teacher, a 4-H leader, a teacher. They told them about their excitement. And this second person then guided them into where they could learn more about it. And what the student said was, and this was she said in locked in on an exciting interest to truly influence their lives, it may take two different people at two different times. You may need someone to spark an interest, to get their attention, but then you'll need someone to guide them into how they can learn more about it, to give them more details, to nurture them to be around when they needed help. And she said that work also inspired her at the Minnesota Zoo. She said, now I know what my role is. She said, my role is to light that flame, to be the spark. But she said, I know I've got to rely on the teachers and the others who come out here, that they have to play an important role. And so part of my team is to help those others around me, because I know that if anything's going to happen, it's going to be that group of people that are able to open the doors. And so I'd suggest to you that there is some value in a collection of stories, that sometimes there is a pattern that tells us important truths about how things work, how things happen. And sometimes we don't see it in a single story, but maybe it takes 5, 10, 25 stories before you begin to see something. And that improves your confidence in what you're looking at. Okay, here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I would like you, between now and October 31st, to be on the lookout for stories. On October 31st, we're going to have another session. And in this session, I'm not going to talk much, but you are. And I'm going to invite you to tell stories about something relating to public health. That when I first thought of this, I thought the first two themes were the best ones to look at. A customer or a client who succeeds, or slight variation, a bright spot, someplace where something is going well, somebody is doing something, and we want to tell about it. And so, but the more I thought about it, the more it occurred to me that maybe there are other themes that you are more concerned about right now, something that in your work and what you're doing, there is something else that is a critical story. And I'd like to open the door and saying that, okay, if you have another theme you want to add, I'm open to that possibility. I'd prefer one of these two, but if you have something else, as long as you can tell it in less than 4 minutes. And so here is the deal. You have to submit the story to me in writing, either Word or PDF, by October 24th. Send it to me at this address and put in the title line story and your name so that I don't miss it. And then send it in to me. What I also need you to fill out, there's an instruction sheet that might have been sent to you that gives you some tips about how to do that. And also there's a little form about sharing your video of your story. I'd like you to tell your story, and we need a video consent for you to do that. And so on October 31st, we're going to have people share stories. Now, as an incentive, we're going to have five $50 awards, cash, for people who submit. These will be selected at random from the people. If there's only 5 people, everybody gets $50. If there's more than 5, we will draw names, and 5 people will do it. The stories must be told orally and must be told within 4 minutes. And so that's what we're looking for. Also, these stories, if in the event we get too many stories, and by the way, it hadn't occurred to me, but yes, you could submit more than one story, but you can only, if you're selected to present, you can only present one of the stories. If we get more than we can handle, we're going to make a printed copy, and everyone who signs in can get a copy of the stories that are told. So think about what fun we're going to have on October 31st, where you might share a story that has happened. The story needs to be true, that you need to be sure that you have consent of the person who tells you the story, that you can tell that story. If you have any questions as you go along, feel free to send me a note, and we can talk about it a bit.